The share of the nation's wealth continues to grow for Australia's wealthy, with a new report showing nearly a quarter of all wealth is held by the richest 1% of Australian society. The author of that report is Cameron Allen, a senior research fellow at Monash University, who joins us now from Brisbane. Cameron Allen, thanks for being with us. You assessed 80 indicators on the nation's economy. We're going backwards in more than a third of them. What are we getting wrong?
Well, thanks, Guy, for having me on the show. So we've launched this week our new report, which assesses Australia's progress, as you say, on 80 different economic, social, environmental indicators. And it's really, a helicopter view, I guess, on the state of the nation. And we're seeing that, on about 50% of those indicators, progress has stagnated or is going backwards. There's not really any particular area where those negative trends are concentrated. So we're seeing them across the board. If we look at economic indicators, for example, we're going backwards in investment in innovation and research, in household debt. If we look at social indicators, we're going backwards in terms of income and wealth inequality, housing and financial stress, psychological distress and suicide rates, amongst others. And if we look at environmental indicators, we're going backwards on things like threatened species, on sustainable fishing, on forest area, etc. So it's a really broad spectrum of challenges, and there's not really any one particular driver that's driving all of those outcomes. But a common thread through these would be underinvestment in key areas.
40% of Australians own now just 5% of the nation's wealth, so nearly half the country owns just 5%. Does your research on this basically shatter the myth of Australia being an egalitarian society?
Well, I don't know about shattering the myth, Guy, but when we look at the data on wealth inequality, we are going backwards. So the share of the wealth of the bottom 40% of Australian households has declined from around 7.8% in 2004 to around 5.5% over around 20 years. At the same time, the share of wealth of the top 20% of households has actually gone up. So we are seeing a declining trend in wealth inequality in Australia, which is a concern. And it's a concern because at some point these inequalities can actually fuel social tensions and conflict, as we've seen across the events happening in the United States.
How do we turn this around?
Well, wealth inequality is obviously a pretty complex challenge, and there's not really going to be any silver bullet. But what we do in this report is not only look at the worsening trends or where trends are improving over time, we also look forward at what types of policies might actually turn these negative trends around and boost progress towards our targets by 2030, as well as over the long term to 2050. And I think an important piece of the puzzle in inequality is really looking at poverty and reducing poverty. So around 3.3 million Australians live in poverty, which is quite a shocking statistic. About 760,000 of those are children. So I think addressing poverty is a good place to start. And when we look at the adequacy of welfare payments in Australia, so they have declined sharply over time. So looking back at data in 2001, our welfare payments were pretty much enough to live at the poverty line. That's declined to around 65% of the amount needed to live at the poverty line. So it's probably no wonder we have a poverty problem in Australia. So we do look at modelling, different types of tax reforms, increase in social welfare transfers, and what sort of impacts that would have on these indicators over the long term. And what we found is some really tangible improvements. So we could halve poverty and reduce income inequality by a third by 2050 by implementing these types of measures.
But those measures require long-term planning. How likely is it that governments would look beyond the current election cycle to actually implement these kinds of policies?
Yeah, well, what we're advocating for in our report is that governments take a more integrated and long-term approach to decision making. And, I acknowledge that, at the moment the incentives are not really in place to encourage that type of thinking. Now, in our report, we provide some important tools to help operationalise that thinking. So we, measure progress on a broad range of economic, social, environmental indicators. We look at long-term trends and set 2030 target values to start to shift that to long-term thinking. And we use modelling to look at the types of policies that could achieve those targets. But these types of tools are not going to be used by government unless there are incentives in place to incentivise that long-term thinking, because ultimately they're held accountable to election cycles. and they're facing, immediate problems that they need to resolve. But it's important that we do look at different mechanisms that could encourage this type of long-term thinking. And even just this week, a bill was introduced into Parliament, the Wellbeing and Future Generations Bill, which actually provides some potential solutions to this challenge by requiring governments to look at well-being when they're making decisions, and also by creating a Future Generations Commissioner. So often when governments are making decisions, they have the various interests at the table, but the interests of future generations are not there at the table. So having a commissioner for future generations would give future generations a seat at the table and help to encourage that long-term thinking.